So a number of years ago, my wife gave to me for my birthday one of those DNA tests. Has anybody here ever taken one of those DNA tests? It's where you spit in something and send it off to a company, and then you're supposed to get a report back, information about what countries your ancestors came from. And I was excited to kind of do this. When I got my report back, I wasn't surprised that mostly it was Northern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula. Most of my percentage came from those areas, which is pretty obvious. But I actually had a very small percentage, and this surprised me, from Africa, from Nigeria especially, which I was very intrigued by. But I really enjoyed kind of seeing this report. It was kind of fun, and it made me wonder about these people who passed along to me my genetic heritage. I know I have them to blame for my high cholesterol and my tendency to kidney stones. And I found myself feeling a sense of connection in a way with people who were my ancestors. People from the past who I knew, to be truthful, practically next to nothing. I was even struck by a mystical feeling of being part of something much larger than myself, something bigger than I was, shaped and formed by ways in this long line of generations that go back centuries and across the world. Who were they, I wondered? How did they see their world? And I imagine they were just like other people, good and bad, wise and foolish, rich and poor. Some of them were probably religious, some of them probably were not. Some lived in joy, others in sorrow. Some may have created great things, while some of my ancestors may have destroyed them. They were human, and it kind of felt like I'm part of this great river of humanity that extends back hundreds, if not thousands of years in different parts of this wide globe of the earth. This great river of humanity that flows through me now to my own children and soon my grandson to be born. There's a mystical feeling about that, and I wanted to know who they were. That river of humanity flowed through Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew begins his story with this begat by tracing for 28 generations, going back to Abraham, the founder, the father of faith, the people who birthed him into the world. And we recognize some of the names, probably from Sunday school. What do we remember? What jumped out at us? Isaac, Jacob, David, and Solomon, even Joseph. But most of the names we do not know. The sheer number of names can make you say, whew, right? And it's interesting, is since the Jews were very patriarchal, very much rooted in this idea that heredity is simply passed from the male side, it is not surprising that there are mostly men's names on this list. But what's interesting is that despite this patriarchal kinds of way of looking at the world, there are a number of women who show up in this lineage, in this family tree. The women's stories are actually the more interesting ones in many ways, because even as disempowered as they were in the world at the time, through their intelligence, through their energy, through their creativity, through their courage, they were able to make an impact on this very patriarchal world and be remembered. Tamar, I don't know, does anybody remember Tamar from Sunday school? Tamar is a really interesting woman who basically had to trick her husband to get pregnant. And And you ought to look it up on Wikipedia. It can get kind of a little X-rated, to be honest. But Tamar is a very interesting woman who was smart enough and intelligent enough to find a way in which she could bear a child in the world. And then you come to some of the other women. There's Rahab. Who remembers Rahab? The story of Jericho. She was an innkeeper, supposedly an innkeeper, maybe something else as well, according to the patriarchal tradition. But Rahab, who was not even Jewish, becomes part of this lineage of Jesus. And then Ruth, who's mentioned very next. She's a Moabite. So the very heritage of Jesus comes from a non-Jewish line of people. Important that they are mentioned and lifted up to indicate the kind of background Jesus came from. To Mary, the mother of Jesus. And despite the tendency for our scriptures, unfortunately, to focus mostly on the men, the women fight their way on to the family tree, which is important. And let's be honest, the men are a mixed bag of humanity, if you remember your stories. There are kings and carpenters, shepherds and farmers. There are charlatans and tricksters, honorable people with great integrity and not so honorable people. Jacob is well known, often referred to as the heel grabber. Jacob was well known to be a trickster and cheat to get his inheritance. Now, Nashon, who I did a little research on, is actually this kind of hero. He's purported to have been the first to step into the Red Sea as Moses parted it and became a great leader within the Israelite tribes. And then, of course, you got King David, that beloved child of God. I'm not sure, only God could love David. But God did love David, who, as we know in the heritage, it's even mentioned there, arranged for a faithful soldier to be killed so he could steal his wife. Josiah, you may not know the name, but Josiah was considered one of the great and faithful kings of Israel. There they are, all this long line of misfits and misanthropes stumbling along, leading to the birth of Jesus, somehow surrounded by and spurred on by the grace of God. We, like Jesus, have these genealogies that go back generation after generation. And I know a lot of people, and I understand why, a lot of people trace their family trees way, way back. And I understand why, because it reminds us, I think, of something very important about our humanity, that we are connected. Our lives are made meaningful because of theirs. And it's not simply the passing of the genes, right? But a sense of reverence, if you think about it, for the stories of their lives that they lived in the world they passed along to us. The stories, our family stories, shape us and give us meaning. I don't know about you, but when we were gathered as a family this past Christmas holidays, we told a lot of stories, memories from the past, and of things that had happened in our family, memories of my mother, Nano, and my step-grandfather, Poppy, stories of Teresa's mom and dad. There were stories to tell that somehow coming together as a family are important to tell each other, though we've probably told them all over and over again. And why? Because it reminds us we are connected and gives a meaning to our lives. I tell stories of my mother in a lot of ways because they inspire me. She was abandoned as a toddler, raised by the city of Dallas, yet had enough grace, enough courage, enough grit to create a family of her own. Or of a father who, as a child, of an unwed pregnant teenager in a depression. Can you imagine? Children of sharecroppers. I heard stories of a grandparent who was a drunk and of grandparents who were poor sharecroppers. They were all a part of who I am. Misfits and heroes. One of my favorite books was written, it's really actually a novella it was made into a movie, written by Norman Maclean. A River Runs Through It. Who's read the book and or seen the movie? It's a really interesting book set in Montana about a family living in Montana. I think part of the reason I like it, I think he was a Presbyterian pastor. It's part of the reason I loved it. I really identified with the father, who had two sons, one who was pretty faithful and was good and did the right things. Another son who was a little wild. He was a little crazy, kind of a prodigal, if you will. And what they shared as a family is a love of fly fishing. And it's an appreciation for creation and the beauty in the world in which they lived in Montana. But this description, this image of fly fishing. I know after I think read the book and had seen the movie, I tried to take up fly fishing, but I didn't have enough patience or skill really to do anything with it. It was so inspiring because in many ways the fly fishing is a description, is a metaphor for how to live a good life with skill and with grace. And it is a novel about the beauty of creation and our small lives that exist in the midst of it, and the movie is filled with humor and love and tenderness, but also pain and sorrow and tragedy. And Maclean ends the novel with this great line that I love. He says, "Eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it." Eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. I find inspiration that the river that runs through my life and each of our lives, something that we will pass on to our children, something we've passed on to our grandchildren, is a reminder of how our lives have purpose and meaning. A river runs through us, the river of God's grace and love, from generation to generation to generation. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.